So hello, thank you so much, Tash, for that fantastic introduction and the invitation to come speak to you today about my book, Queer Data, and wider work that's involved in related to gender, sex and sexuality data projects across the UK. So what I plan to cover, I'm going to speak for about 20 minutes, pick out some themes from the book and what I thought was kind of particularly relevant to the audience and people working in publishing, some themes around visibility and representation and how that kind of sits alongside questions about data. So most of my talks since the book came out in January have been online. So I do like to kind of start by saying a bit about who I am as a kind of person behind the screen, hopefully getting a better sense of my work and kind of how it sits in a range of different sectors, organisations and ongoing discussions. So I live in Edinburgh at the moment, but work at the University of Glasgow, and my actual research is looking at gender equality policies in the film and television industries of the UK, Canada and Germany. Before starting this role in 2021, I worked for about 5 years for a higher education organisation in the UK, looking at equality, diversity and inclusion practices. So this role was very much working on the front line with practitioners engaged in a range of EDI issues. Prior to this and going back now into the mid 2010s, I did a PhD in history, so that's kind of my academic training in gender history, looking at architecture and design in the mid 20th century. So if you're wondering why there's a cartoon of an architect in the bottom of the screen, that is the reason why. So I'm kind of thinking what joins the dots between these different projects, these different areas of interest. For me, across all my work is kind of an examination of what happens in the space where questions of data and identity intersect. And what I'm going to hopefully cover in the next 20 minutes cuts across theory, practice, research, policy, but I think most importantly, and above all else, provide some prompts, some questions, some reflections for your work and the projects you're involved in, where they relate to LGBTQ lives and data. So what am I going to cover? As I said, I've picked out just a handful of themes from queer data, and I thought it'd be helpful to just kind of offer a definition of what I mean by queer data and what's covered in the book. Talk through a kind of a key thread running through the book and running through a range of different equality, diversity and inclusion projects is the relationship between data and problems. Thinking through the question whether we need more data in terms of LGBTQ lives and some challenges that might present. A key area for me is thinking through the use of data and how we use it for action, particularly in regards to audiences and how we present and communicate ideas about LGBTQ data. And lastly, kind of jumping to the kind of key argument in my book, I argue that we have enough evidence of the problem. How do we move on to the next step and go about fixing it? So I want to kind of kick things off in a fairly unconventional manner in a talk about quantitative data by sharing a lengthy extract from a fiction book. So I'm sure many others in the call had the pleasure earlier this year of reading Detransition Baby by Tori Peters, and I came across this quote in the book that comes from the main character Reese and provides a really evocative example as to how queer identities and quantitative data intersect. So I'll give you a few seconds to look through the text on the screen and just say I'm happy to share my slides afterwards for anybody who hasn't got a screen in front of them at the moment. So I want to keep that quote in the front of your mind during my talk, as you'll hopefully see aspects of that quote emerging at different ideas I'm going to cover. So returning to queer data, in the book, I build upon the work of fantastic scholars, practitioners and activists and describe queer data as consisting of two strands. Firstly, data about LGBTQ communities with a particular focus in my work on quantitative data. And secondly, strand 2 is asking questions about or querying the methods used to collect, analyse and present all types of data. Now, this first strand you'll probably be a bit more familiar with. This is the challenge of locating, analysing and presenting data about LGBTQ people, whether it be experiences or different lives, the collection of data about LGBTQ communities. Now, the second strand of queer data differs in that it both complements and challenges the collection, analysis and use of data about LGBTQ communities. This second strand, this kind of querying of data, asks questions about the methods used to collect, analyse and present data. It moves the focus from those positioned as a subject of our project, so those we're kind of wanting to investigate in our work, to instead think about the politics, the history and the power of those who undertake these studies. So as I argue in queer data, this second strand does not presuppose a need for more or better data about LGBTQ communities. In fact, it highlights how efforts to accumulate more and more and more data can inflict harm upon the communities they claim to help, and actually, in some situations, move us further away from addressing inequality. I'll say a bit more about that during our kind of question and answer session at the end of today's talk as well. So the relationship between data and problems, what I mentioned in my introduction, is really foundational to my work, both in the book and my current areas of research and interest at the moment. Across all areas of my research, time and time again, I find myself magnetically drawn to one overarching question. Who or what is considered a problem, and to whom do they present a problem? So as I imagine many of you will come across in whatever area of work you're engaged in, one of the most common uses of data is to describe or to make sense of a problem or something understood as problematic. So this might be in diversity monitoring forms for people working in human resources. It might be a part of a kind of a research commission. It might be a kind of exploratory scoping exercise for looking at who's maybe writing books or what themes are they publishing stuff on. Again, it's amassing of data to make sense of something perceived as problematic. So in my current work on equality, diversity, inclusion in the film industry, there's no shortage of problems. From underrepresentation of women directors, a lack of racial diversity, an absence of screen content about the experiences of LGBTQ communities, or issues of bullying and harassment. So I share these examples from my work in film to show that what is considered a problem and what problems are understood as worth solving are not natural features of the sector. They're the products and interests of those already in positions of power. The publishing industry, of course, is not immune to equality, diversity and inclusion challenges, and we see examples of problems across a range of areas, including who's published and what stories are told, how much people are paid for their labour and their work, who is invited to share their work at festivals and events, and whose work is recognised by awards. So for those working on equality, diversity and inclusion issues in whatever sector they're working, we are told that to fix the problems, we first need to gather evidence about the nature, size and scale of the problem before work can commence. But, I argue in the book, in the search for more or better data, whether it be through surveys, focus groups, consultations or stakeholder engagements, we invite a whole host of changes to the individuals and communities under investigation. So the gathering of more and more data can invite increased interest into issues that bring both positives and negatives. Decisions made about how to collect data on different communities are not necessarily fair. I therefore think it's important to highlight some challenges that I encounter when working with queer data. So to confuse matters, the requirement to collect identity data as a bedrock of many studies, projects or initiatives can construct a false account of people's identity characteristics as something frozen in time and space. However, we know this not to be the case. Identity characteristics are historically situated, as we see in studies of past cultures and societies. What it means to identify as disabled in 2022, for example, is different from 1972 or 1872. And individuals' identity characteristics can also change over time. So the human subjects of our interventions and our initiatives might change their religious identity, their sexual orientation, identify as disabled, or with a different ethnic group, for example. The fluidity of identity means the data collected about a sample can quickly change in a relatively short period of time. So the data collection tools that we use in our work must account for how identities are temporal and, where possible, allow for repeated data collection that provides participants with methods to update their information on an ongoing basis. So a kind of second challenge that I come across in my work when working with LGBTQ data is the question of uneven distribution. When it comes to data, the starting point for a data feminist approach, as argued by Catherine D'Ignacio and Lauren F. Klein in their brilliant book Data Feminism, is that power is not distributed equally in the world. Those who wield power are disproportionately elite, straight, white, non-disabled, cisgender men from the global north. It's therefore vital that whatever projects we're working on, we acknowledge the uneven distribution of data. The US Data Justice Group, Data for Black Lives, argue that data does not exist in a vacuum isolated from social and political contexts, and that in their work on racial justice, it's necessary to interpret data through the lens of structural racism. I'm happy, as I mentioned earlier, to share my slides after the talk, which has kind of further prompts for any further reading on the exciting work of these two, this organisation and these two scholars. So turning the focus to think about the uneven distribution of data and what this means for LGBTQ people, Jenja Giesking highlights that most historical data about LGBTQ communities has only been used to stigmatise and to pathologise, and this has contributed to a lack of quality existing data about LGBTQ people. Given the historical oppression of LGBTQ communities, it's likely that when we use this data as our starting point to build new projects, these harmful histories are embedded in the design. These harms are most pronounced for those most minoritised within the broader LGBTQ umbrella, such as Black queer people. Shaka McLaughlin, on the right-hand side of my slide, for example, notes that data has operated as a tool of race and racism that reduces lives to mere numbers, where people appear as mere commodities, revenue streams, statistical deviations, or vectors of risk. So this all goes to show that when available data exists, whether it's quantitative results from a survey or secondary analysis of data tables, this will likely overrepresent the views of those who have historically been privileged in the context or environment under investigation. So I would say that whatever type of work you're involved in, whether it's designing a new equality and diversity initiative or undertaking a study of LGBTQ writers, it's really important to ensure that undercounts or misrepresentations are not used to undermine political and social advances. And those using data about LGBTQ individuals need to proactively assert how the information presented is flawed. A queer approach means that we need to expose the limits of data that can test the decisions made during collection and analysis, and how efforts to count LGBTQ communities only ever presents one representation of the social world. So as a response, and I'm sure many in the call have heard this demand in meetings, in kind of things about how do we address issues of homophobia, transphobia, racism, misogyny, demands that we need more data. Quantitative and qualitative data can undoubtedly play a key role in engaging people in positions of power to make changes, to use the media to change narratives about minoritized communities, and our work with institutions to create spaces that are inclusive and equal. Existing data is sparse for reasons I've covered in my talk, but in the context of the UK, its availability, scope and detail are increasing slowly. So on the screen, I've shared some examples of data related to who works in the UK publishing industry. Now, with these figures, there's still much missing. There's still lots of gaps and absences that we don't know about. But rather than jumping to plug these data gaps, I want you to think critically about whether this lack of data actually matters. And if so, how do we go about designing data practices that engage LGBTQ communities in ways that are fair, non-extractive, and actually make a positive difference? So you might have guessed from my tone that I don't believe that the accumulation of more and more data is the answer to all of our problems. Writing about data on racial injustice in the US, sociologist Ruha Benjamin argues that the problem is not a lack of knowledge, and that demanding data on subjects that we already know much about is actually a perversion of knowledge. Minoritized groups are invited to accumulate yet more data about injustice, burning through finite resources to provide further proof of the problem. But think, what if this time, money and energy was used in other ways? What if this money and this labour was spent on the development of mental health services, the provision of community level legal support, or monetary help with overdue bills and outstanding rent payments? Gathering more data on the problem when enough evidence already exists can contribute to the development of damage-centred or deficit narratives about the groups under investigation. As observed by Ignacio and Klein in Data Feminism, data accumulated tends to focus on problems as removed from a rounded account of people's strengths, creativity and agency, and this can sometimes do little to change the status quo for the better. So for Ignacio and Klein, minoritized individuals and groups should not have to repeatedly prove that their experiences of oppression are real. So in queer data, I describe three kind of life phases of data: its collection, its analysis, and its use. And I increasingly believe this final phase, the presentation and publication of data, is the most important, but is too often overlooked. With presentation comes decisions about what stories to tell and how we go about telling them. And thinking about the use of data also begs the question, to whom are minoritized individuals and groups expected to present the data collected? In my work in higher education and in film and television, LGBTQ communities, we need to ask, why are we expected to collect, analyse and present data as a prerequisite for change? Information about LGBTQ lives is often intended to change the hearts and minds of a cis heterosexual audience. However, this cis heterosexual audience may or may not take action depending on the quality of the proof provided. The presentation of data can therefore function as a means to convince others to do something. And as you might imagine, any reliance on already powerful individuals and organisations to take action is problematic. Principle 21 of a fantastic kind of statement called the Feminist Data Manifesto highlights how projects intended to address inequity cannot rely on the goodwill of institutions to fix problems. The manifesto rightly highlights a missing step between the production of knowledge about a problem and the rationale for responding to the findings presented. We've also seen how the presentation of data about LGBTQ lives can be used in good and bad ways. For example, recent data from a Gallup survey in the US found that a record 7.1% of adults identified as lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, or something other than heterosexual or cis. And this was double the percentage from 2012. When data is broken down by generational groups, 21% of those who are Gen Z, so those born between 1997 and 2003, identify as LGBTQ. Sadly, this data can also serve the interests of those opposed to LGBTQ progress. So last month, the US comedian Bill Maher used data about the increasing proportion of people identifying as LGBTQ to ridicule LGBTQ lives as trendy and suggests that everyone will identify as LGBTQ in the future, and using this data as a means to attack affirmative healthcare for trans young people. So I make this point to show that data needs to fall on the ears of people with power that wish to listen, and that the use of data can both serve those wishing to advance LGBTQ rights, but also those opposed to LGBTQ progress. To bring things to a conclusion, why does any of this matter, and what's its relevance for your work in publishing and your work with Bloomsbury? Applying a queer lens to data practices poses questions about neutrality, biases, politics, and power. And as I've argued in this kind of brief introduction to queer data, the use of data to make sense of a problem, something understood by those in positions of power as unwelcome, can actually divert energy from changing exclusionary structures or the overhaul of rotten institutions. And above all else, what do I want you to take away? What's the one thing I'm kind of keen for you to take away from this talk? So my key argument in the final chapter of Queer Data is that in the UK, we have enough evidence of the problem. How do we go about fixing it? And I hate to find myself fighting for the status quo. It's very dull and boring. But sadly, in many areas of my work in the UK at the moment, this is where we are in terms of LGBTQ issues. My focus right now is strengthening the resilience of institutions which are too often complacent on LGBTQ issues and empower them to push back against anti-LGBTQ attacks. By institutions, I mean arts funders, cultural bodies, colleges and universities, and other large organisations that govern our day-to-day lives. All of these institutions make use of data in their decision making and increasingly capture data about the experiences of LGBTQ communities. And it's important for all of these institutions to be mindful that when we design data practices, they don't arrive with us as some sort of apolitical or ahistorical artifact. Data practices don't collect information about the outside world as static, fixed, and simply waiting to be uncovered. Rather, these practices are crafted, tweaked and changed to serve the particular interests of individuals, organisations or ways of thinking. And finally, as I mentioned, the reliance on the goodwill of powerful individuals and organisations to do something serves as an unsustainable foundation to improve LGBTQ lives. Rather than a force to produce something new, whether good or bad, data or demands for more data can operate as a jam in the system that perpetuates status quo and protects current ways of working. So data is central to positively changing the lives of LGBTQ people, but its use for action still requires evidence to fall upon the ears of individuals who wish to listen and take action in response. So I hope that in this kind of brief introduction, that thinking through the intersection of LGBTQ lives and our approach to data sparks new and wider questions about how we produce knowledge and change the world for the better.
Wow, thank you so much, Kevin. Much to think about there and dig into. I'm just going to come back on screen if I can quickly. To remind everyone that if you have questions or comments, please pop them into the Q&A box, the two little speech bubbles at the top of your screen. Just click on there and we will put those questions to Kevin. But just to start things off, I'm going to pop you on screen. There we go. So before we kind of dig into what you've said there in the presentation, maybe I just wanted to ask, because you recently gave evidence to the Scottish Parliament's Equalities, Human Rights and Civil Justice Committee on the Gender Recognition Reform Bill in Scotland. So I wondered if you could just tell us a bit about that, what you were arguing for and what the response has been.
Yeah, I'm happy to speak to that. So in Scotland at the moment, there is a piece of legislation going through the Scottish Parliament that is ultimately looking to reform the Gender Recognition Act. So this has been a discussion both in Scotland and across the wider UK about the Gender Recognition Act, which is a piece of legislation which was introduced in 2004 and allows people to change the the sex marker on their birth certificate. So it's the process by which that is undertaken. And the Scottish Parliament are looking at simplifying the process, moving away from a model where you have to kind of present evidence to a panel, moving to a model where you can declare, kind of self-declare this legal change. So I was quite surprised to receive an invite to present evidence on this bill. I didn't see there was a huge link to data practices as they currently stand in Scotland or the UK. But I think what the kind of bill gets at is this wider question of how do we disclose information about how we identify. So in the book, I write a little bit about kind of self-identification. So whether it's our gender or sex or sexuality or race, or whether we have a disability or religion, all of these ideas, these questions in data are often gathered in a way where we are identifying in a certain way, we are self-identifying information about our characteristics. If you think of the census, that's probably the most obvious example of where we do this. This kind of large data collection exercise where we're asked about how we identify in a variety of ways. So basically my argument in Parliament was that the bill doesn't do anything to change how we complete a survey or how we complete a census or share information about our identity with our employer. I think for me, it's kind of trying to think, how do I battle some of the misinformation about things around trans rights or LGBTQ rights? How do we kind of, as researchers, as writers, as academics, how do we push back against those attacks in a meaningful way? So I was really honoured to have been invited and hopefully contribute in a very, very, very small way to the bill's passage through Parliament and hopefully the reform of that important piece of legislation.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's hope so. And it reminds me of the quote that you had at the beginning of your presentation from Detransition Baby, which if anyone hasn't read, you absolutely should. It's a brilliant book, about that kind of idea of, you know, lots of people in the community identify in different ways. And it was something that interested me when I was reading the book as well, that language can often kind of fail us when we're trying to express identities or orientations. So like where censuses and surveys are concerned, people from the community might not see the way that they specifically identify listed as a response option. So do you think, you know, is there a solution to that? Is that when you're talking about quantitative and qualitative data, there's that kind of often a multiple choice, but also an other box? Is that where that kind of thing comes into its own?
I think a really fascinating question. I think I could spend hours speaking about the relationship between language and identity and whether, I think for kind of LGBTQ plus identities, the sense of, does the word need to exist before the identity, or what comes first? Is it the term or the way of identifying with that term? And I think for me, some of the most fascinating work is when we look outside of the context of the UK and how in other cultures and societies, other gender, sex and sexuality identities exist with other words to describe things. And I do some work in North America, and terms like two-spirit, for example, don't have any direct equivalent to how we might conceptualize that in the context of the UK. And this is just across geographies, never mind across time periods and history, and how we kind of, how words and language plays a role in what it means to be queer, for example, in 2022 versus what that word would mean 10, 20, 30, 40 years ago. So I think that relationship between language and identity is fascinating. And I think there's always this tension, in particular in quantitative data, between how do we design something that reflects the diversity, the messiness of life, versus quantitative data, which is looking for categories, groups, quite neat boxes to put people in. And what I hope to do with the book is kind of not say that these two kind of islands are unbridgeable in a way. What I wanted to do with the book was try and present some messy way of working between queer lives and quantitative data practices. And as you mentioned in your question, some of those ways are these kind of multiple choice questions, the kind of tick all apply, which I'm increasingly seeing, which I think is great. So actually not saying that you have to pick whether you're gay or queer, actually designing a survey where you can tick both if you wish, alongside the use of kind of write-in boxes. So there might be a kind of in another way response option, and you have the option then to type in your own words how you identify. And this was something that the census actually was quite good at. both the census in England and Wales and the Scottish census, it did provide that space to write in other sexual orientations and other gender identities as well in the census. I guess for me, though, there is a question of how the data is going to be used. So it's great having this very, at the surface level, this very inclusive approach, but actually if that data is, when it comes to being analysed or presented, is thrown in the bin, then actually it is maybe something which is more performative than actually meaningfully wish to value the diversity of different identities. Worryingly as well, through my work, particularly in higher education, sometimes at the surface level you have these very inclusive options where when you go behind kind of under the bonnet and it comes to the analysis, sometimes data analysts will themselves aggregate groups and start to make decisions about how people identify in terms of analysis and presentations. So you might say there's 3 people identified as pansexual, 3 people identified as polysexual, well, let's just put them in the same group. And I think that's very problematic for a variety of reasons. So I guess, yeah, your kind of questions opened up a few different threads. So hopefully that kind of got at the fascinating subject of language and identity in a roundabout way.
Yeah, it is fascinating. And like you say, if the data is then presented as, you know, if people who choose to use the other box and write in are just then presented as, oh, this percentage of people are other, you know, that's actually a kind of an erasure rather than a representation. Yeah. Okay. And so you talked in the presentation, and you talk in the book about how data practices can create a state of distraction that prevents other actions taking place. Could you go into that a bit more about how it can kind of work against social justice, and maybe how we can overcome that going forward?
Yeah, I think it's a real key problem. I think what I wanted to do with the book is be that kind of critical voice in the room, that kind of contrarian voice who's going, actually, there are some limitations and some harms to how we do equality, diversity and inclusion work, whether it's in universities or in the publishing industry. And I think challenging the sense that doing this work isn't a universal good. It does require people's time, people's energy, people's resources, and can also sometimes distract from more radical and more meaningful change. And I think data plays a really key role in this kind of distraction or the stalling technique. So my writing around data is very much inspired by the work of Sarah Ahmed, who's a feminist scholar working around with a recent book on complaint and kind of complaint practices, and how these systems around how you complain are designed in ways which actually can push the problem further into long grass or distract people from getting at the heart of the issue. So with data, I became really conscious in universities and colleges that the easy answer to accusations of homophobia or transphobia or racism, the easy answer is to commission a study, is to do a piece of research, or to collect some data about the problem. And it's at the level of a university or an industry, that could be a massive undertaking. This could be a 1 year, £50,000 project to get more data on the extent of the problem. And I'm sure this isn't a problem. This isn't an approach that's unique to universities. I'm sure with many challenges in publishing, this is often a solution to kind of responding to these accusations. But for me, I kind of question, why do we need more evidence? If you have many people telling you this is a problem, do we need to be spending this time, this money, this energy getting further proof of the problem? Or is it a stalling technique? Is actually this kind of demand for data operating as something that allows people to go, we're doing something, just kind of leave us be? And I hope that people working in these equality and diversity spaces can feel more comfortable and able to challenge and push back about this kind of demand for data, and actually see how data can, in some situations, function as a means to stall more radical or more structural change. And I think that's definitely one of the dangers or harms of data that data can do for the LGBTQ communities.
Yeah, absolutely. We've had a question in which kind of ties into that, I think, which is just asking if you could say a bit more about how the resilience of institutions, like you mentioned, could be part of an alternative solution as opposed to the gathering of more and more data.
Oh, A good question. So it's a real area of interest for me right now. It's about kind of institutional resilience, particularly with data. So what we've seen in the context of England and Wales is there was a court case and a fight about how the sex question was going to be asked in the English and Welsh census. There was a similar court case in Scotland, and the court decision went the other way. So the slightly kind of different trajectories across the UK. But what worries me about what's happening in England and Wales is because the sex question in the census has now advises people to answer according to their birth certificate or what's on their gender recognition certificate. It's a very narrow definition of sex. And what worries me is that the census, being this kind of gold standard in data collection exercises, is trickling down to other industries and other ways of collecting data. So often people will go, how do we ask questions about the 9 protected characteristics in the Equality Act? Let's look at the census. When we're looking at the census in England and Wales, that's a very narrow definition of sex. So what I hope to do with my work is around data, giving institutions the ability to kind of look beyond the headlines in a way and actually question how are we collecting this data? Why are we collecting this data? What's its purpose? And questioning the politics and power, particularly behind quantitative data, and who's being counted and who's being excluded from these practices. So what I hope to do, I sometimes think with my work, is it better to work within institutions or work outside of institutions pushing against them? Or is there a way where we can both work within the system and step outside the system and kind of push against it? And I think that kind of strengthening of institutional resilience, whether it's arts councils, funders, large publishers, empowering them to be able to push back against particularly anti-LGBTQ attacks. I know the universities are subject to freedom of information requests, attacks in the right-wing press on a regular basis, similar to publishers, literary festivals. All of these large organisations are facing a raft of LGBTQ attacks. And I think developing that resilience to be able to push back and to kind of state your position with confidence, I think is really key to this kind of next stage of LGBTQ activism. And I think for me, data plays a really key role in that we need to think critically about its use, its purpose, and also people who are maybe claiming to be quantitative data experts. We all have an agenda, even if we're academics, scholars, researchers, we're all kind of seeing things in a certain way. And I think kind of embracing the politics of that rather than pretending that what we're doing is apolitical or ahistorical when it's not.
Yeah, and do you think that there's something to be said for making sure that people who identify as LGBTQ are part of the community are involved in designing the kind of data practices? And I think you mentioned as part of the querying the data idea that making sure that those people are involved in that process, and also as part of that, if people are not from or don't identify as LGBTQ+, what do they need to kind of keep in mind?
I think it's a tricky question. I think it's something I kind of struggled when writing one of the chapters, which kind of asks who's in the room and who should be in the room when designing, whether it's data practices or who's designing LGBTQ mentorship schemes or training programs, who should have a voice in those spaces. So I definitely argue that if you're designing a new LGBTQ initiative or program or project or data practice, that you need to be meaningfully engaging with a community that's going to be disproportionately impacted by the thing you're designing. So I think it would be wild to design an LGBTQ mentorship scheme without engaging LGBTQ communities in the design of that initiative. At the same time, I didn't want to argue that you have to have lived experience of the thing that you are working on or engaged with or managing. The reason being is I'm really conscious of people's time, resources, emotional labour in all of these projects. And I was concerned that if there was an expectation for everyone to be engaged on the thing under discussion, you had to have lived experience of it. It's asking a lot from some already minoritized and marginalized communities. One example being is the importance of doing more intersectional work. So if we're looking at, for example, the experiences of Black lesbians in publishing, I think there'd be an unfair expectation to expect that that community are always providing their time, their input, their energy into the design, the management, the maintenance, the evaluation of these initiatives and these interventions. And actually, that time, money, and energy is potentially could be used in other ways rather than just providing kind of support for these EDI projects. So I think for me, I kind of argue in I think the penultimate chapter around queer data competence, how we need people who don't themselves have lived experience of the thing under investigation, but they need to have a basic level of competence to be able to design, engage and manage these practices and projects, but also importantly, feel able to go, I don't know enough about this, it's not my space, I need to step back and give room for somebody else who's better qualified to be in the room. And unfortunately, we don't often see that. So around the design of census questions in Scotland, we saw quite a lot of parliamentarians who openly admitted they had just found out what cis meant, designing the question on transgender status in the census. And again, thinking of all the people who should be in the room, are you the person who should be at the table making these decisions when you are openly admitting you know very little about the subject under discussion? So I think there's no right or wrong. I think I kind of come down the middle, but I think we all need to go back to how are we using these finite resources, the time, the labour, the energy of people involved, and doing it in a way that's meaningfully engaging those who are most impacted by the thing under discussion.
Thank you. Another question from the audience. I think this is from Stu. Are you critical of research on sexuality which was carried out by the likes of Lord Humphreys in the US in the 70s or Ken Plummer at Essex in the 80s? Is their work seen as outdated or compromised now by a new generation?
Oh, a very specific question there. I'm not familiar with Lord Humphreys' work. I do know Ken Plummer's work, and his Plummer's work discussed very briefly in the history chapter of queer data. I'm not sure if critical is the right word. I am fascinated by the history of different kind of LGBTQ movements within the UK, and I think it's something which, even as a kind of scholar of gender studies and queer studies, something which I think discovered in my PhD. I don't remember this being taught throughout undergraduate or my kind of master's, definitely not through school, about the differences between kind of gay liberation movements of the 70s versus more kind of small c conservative movements around the kind of legislation in the 1960s and the kind of tensions between those two groups, or in the US context, the kind of the ACT UP movements and the kind of challenges they had with a more kind of mainstream conservative movement around the AIDS crisis in the 80s and 90s. And I think I find the politics within LGBTQ movements fascinating. Sadly, we see some of that today with LGBT Alliance, these kind of differing views on LGBTQ lives and experiences versus basically every other LGBTQ organisation. So I wouldn't say critical. I think the history is key to all the work we do, and I think particularly around data, I think we are blind if we're not thinking through how the history of data collection practices, how data was extracted from LGBTQ communities around kind of criminal records or psychological assessments, how that very negative history won't have an impact on how these communities think about data today. So I think for me, definitely with my kind of historian hat on, it's really key to think through those histories.
Absolutely, yeah. And it reminds me of something that you said about a lot of data in the past having been about negative experiences or painting the communities in a negative light, so focusing on criminality or psychological issues. So yeah, kind of acknowledging that going forward is obviously important. Another question, this one's from Nick, who says, can I ask Kevin about how much his own research or queer studies more generally interacts with Indigenous studies or Black radical thought? He asked because he knows that Indigenous studies are largely based on a drive to speak back to the Western scientific categories and questions that have been imposed on Indigenous people the world over. So wondering if these resonant ideas figure in your thinking, or if there are other resonances or intersections that he hasn't mentioned. And also Nick says, I really love the pillow. And I think that's the pup pillow.
The dog pillow, thank you. It's a very bright backdrop. You can kind of see the second yellow one as well.
Oh, it's a pair.
Very bright dogs. So I think really key. I haven't done a huge amount around Indigenous data practices. I had the pleasure of being on a panel with somebody in the US whose expertise was around that, and it was just fascinating to hear around, again, this kind of intersection around kind of scientific categories and race and different kind of cultural, religious, spiritual groups, how historically this kind of something which presents itself as being apolitical or ahistorical is anything but, and actually has a very kind of white colonial driver to it. And I think around Indigenous studies, that's key. Race studies or kind of critical race studies is far more integral to my work and is real kind of a real shaping influence on the themes in queer data. Both kind of broader ideas around kind of critical race theory and kind of challenging the kind of structures, institutions, and thinking through the kind of the limitations of equality, the limitations of diversity, the potential harms of diversity or equality. And I think lots of that thinking comes from critical race theory. And I've kind of pulled out a few of the scholars in my kind of short presentation, but bringing it up to present day and work around kind of critical racial justice and kind of critical race data. And there's some really exciting work taking place, particularly in North America. So I flagged the work of Data for Black Lives, who are doing really interesting work around kind of the abolition of data. So thinking through the kind of abolition practices that we are more familiar with around prisons and police forces and immigration services, thinking what it might mean to apply an abolitionist approach to data and data collection systems. So actually, there's a huge range of administrative systems that govern our lives, whether it's applying for a mortgage, registering for a doctor, flying a long-haul flight. All of these systems have certain ideas about bodies, lives, who fits and who doesn't fit, and thinking, how do we engage with these data systems? When should we engage, or when should we actually be calling for them to be abolished? And they're thinking around race and the kind of the racist histories of these systems, I think is really key. We can learn a lot when thinking about implications of that for queer communities as well. And also another suggested reading would be the work of Ruha Benjamin, which I flagged in my talk. She has a really fantastic book. I think it's called The New Jim Crow. I think it's called, I can send the link afterwards, but a really fantastic book thinking again through the particular harms the data does to racialized communities in the context of the US. And I think we can learn a lot from that for queer communities in the UK.
Amazing, thank you. That's all of our questions at the moment. I'm just going to give it a kind of another minute to see if anyone wants to pop another one in, but I'm sure everyone's digesting all the information and the ideas. I know I certainly will be reflecting on this afterwards, and we will share Kevin's slides, if that's all right with you, yep. Kevin, in our Pride newsletter this week when we share the recording of this session as well. So I know that lots of people will want to watch it back or watch it if they haven't been able to join us live. So I think I haven't had anything else pop in. So that's probably us done. And just to say thank you so much for joining us and for absolutely fascinating session today.
And thank you for the invitation. Thank you for organising this month of events. And yeah, I think there's a real, I think just the publishing industry has all of these challenges and kind of things are flagged. I think although it's not a space I'm working in directly, I think hopefully some of these ideas have resonated with your work and some of the kind of tricky equality, diversity, inclusion challenges we're all working through.
Absolutely, yeah, lots of food for thought for all of us, I think. So thank you very much, and I hope, do you have sunshine up in Edinburgh today?
We were promised sunshine. I saw all this kind of heat wave landing in London. Hasn't landed in Scotland yet, so hopefully later this week. Yeah, it's grey. Yeah. It's maybe about 12 degrees. It's not June weather here yet.
Well, fingers crossed that you get some of it, and I hope everyone and down in the southern end of England, which I know many of our attendees will be, enjoying the sun today. And we will also look out for an interest for the results of the Scottish Parliament
Yes.
bill that you were speaking to as well. So
yes.
Great, thank you so much, and thanks everyone for joining.
Thanks everyone. Bye now.
Thank you. Bye.